let's study the history of BRICS a little more. The starting point for BRICS was a report by British economist Jim O'Neill, published in 2001 under the title Building Better Global Economic BRICs, Building a Better Global Economy with the BRICs. The document argued that Brazil, Russia, India, and China, there was no talk of South Africa yet, were destined to play a growing role in the world economy and should therefore have greater representation in multilateral institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It was a technocratic proposal, but with political implications. The countries mentioned realized they could turn O'Neill's thesis into a platform for action. Russia, which was seeking to regain international prominence after the crisis of the 1990s, took the lead. In 2006, Russia organized the first ministerial meeting between the four countries on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. They took the opportunity there at the United Nations Assembly and held a ministerial level meeting with the foreign ministers. In the following years, these informal consultations intensified, culminating in the holding of the first summit. At the level of heads of state in 2009, there in Yekaterinburg, South Africa's entry into BRICS in 2010 had symbolic and strategic motivations. From a geopolitical point of view, South Africa is the most industrialized country in Africa and would allow the group to expand its territorial base and strengthen its South-South dimension. From a symbolic point of view, the accession of South Africa projected the idea of an inclusive bloc and representative of global diversity. Despite its informality, BRICS does not have a permanent secretariat or a founding charter. For example, the group has created an institutional architecture. Over time, the annual summits of heads of state are the main event, accompanied by ministerial meetings in various areas, such as economy, health, education, security, and culture, among others. There are also civil society forums, youth forums, academic forums, a business forum, and so on. Perhaps the biggest institutional milestone for BRICS was the creation in 2014, during the Fortaleza summit, of two financial entities, the New Development Bank, the NDB, and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the CRA. The NDB, also known informally as the BRICS Bank, aims to finance infrastructure and sustainable development projects in member countries and other developing nations. The CRA, on the other hand, functions as an international reserve fund with about $100 billion in this fund, and it is a fund designed to offer protection to countries in case of balance of payments crisis. For you to make a comparison, the NDB, the BRICS Bank, is an alternative to the role played by the World Bank, while the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the CRA, works more or less along the lines of the International Monetary Fund. These institutions represent an attempt, a concrete attempt to create alternatives to the international financial system, which is hegemonized by the dollar and by organizations under the control of the West, under the control of the G7. The NDB, the BRICS Bank, has already approved dozens of projects in sectors such as energy, transport, sanitation, and technology. Since 2021, the bank's presidency has been held by Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil, which gave new visibility to the institution as never before had a public figure of such prestige presided over the bank. Dilma Rousseff's term was renewed now in 2025 because Russia gave up its right to the rotating presidency of the NDB and nominated the former Brazilian president Dilma Rousseff to continue in the position for the next 4-year term. Leadership for the next 4-year term that would have been Russia's. I'll correct something here, folks. Dilma has not held the bank's presidency since 2021, but since 2023, the term she completed the Brazilian term which had been which had been decided and initiated under the Bolsonaro government. President Lula elected in 22, and in 23 he appointed President Dilma to replace the then president who had been appointed by Bolsonaro. So Dilma Rousseff served the term from 23 to 25, and now she has received the new 4-year term, this time through. Russia's nomination, which, I repeat, abdicated its term leading the bank, its rotating term leading the bank. Since its creation, BRICS has been the target of skepticism from Western analysts, who point to the differences among its members as an obstacle to the group's consolidation. In fact, there are profound disparities in terms of political regime, economic orientation, international integration, and strategic priorities. As I said, BRICS expresses a counter-hegemonic field and not a system. Just look at the enormous differences that exist between China, India, Russia, Brazil, and so on, both in terms of political regime, economic system, and their relations with the system. Imperialist. Despite this, BRICS has maintained relative cohesion. The group has produced joint communiques that advocate for the reform of international institutions, the strengthening of the UN, respect for national sovereignty, multilateralism, and the fight against protectionism. On many occasions, the BRICS countries have coordinated their positions in UN votes, helping to limit Western influence. China, due to its economic weight, is often seen, and rightly so, as the main actor of the bloc, the main actor of BRICS. Since 2010, China has become the largest economy among BRICS members, responsible for about 70% of the combined GDP of BRICS in 2024, 20% of the product. Of the countries that are part of BRICS, 70% is related to the Chinese GDP. This asymmetry creates tensions, especially with India, with which China has rivalries, but it also offers advantages. Trade with China is a driving force for the other BRICS members, and Beijing has a strategic interest in strengthening the group as a counterweight to the liberal order led by the United States. We have to remember that BRICS emerged in a context of crisis for North American unipolarity, as I have already mentioned. The Iraq War in 2003, the financial crisis of 2008, and the growth of China weakened the authority of the United States as a universal arbiter. The United States claimed this role of universal arbiter for itself. However, these episodes were weakening this function that the United States imagined it would exercise. At the same time, the multilateral system was undergoing a process of attrition, with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank being increasingly questioned for their lack of representation and for having pushed the global south into a major crisis. A crisis that advanced through the 90s and the first part of the 21st century. This generated a lot of dissatisfaction in the global south, and this dissatisfaction in the global south would end up generating, let's say, a critical mass among the countries for the emergence of a counter-hegemonic field, as is the case with BRICS. In this scenario, BRICS presented itself as a vector of a multipolar order, a vector against that unipolar order that existed in the 90s. Although it does not constitute a formal geopolitical alliance, the group acts as a flexible coalition that seeks to defend the interests of the global south and expand the decision-making power of developing countries. This vocation became even more evident after 2020, with the worsening of the conflict between Russia on one side and the USA, and also with the intensification of the dispute. Sino-American